Donald Trump has upended the world order, and it's not clear what will take its place. In the inaugural Vantage Point essay from Australia Institute Press, Dr. Emma Shortis examines the future of our alliance with the United States, which all too often makes us less safe and not more. You can order your copy of After America, Australia in the New World Order now, or you can become a foundation subscriber to Vantage Point and save 25% on an annual subscription. Find it at australiainstitute.org.au/store or via the link in the show notes.
Hello and welcome to Dollars and Cents, the Australia Institute podcast where we're talking about just what the hell is going on in the economy. I'm Elinor Johnston-Leake, the senior content producer here at the Australia Institute, and this week Greg is away at a gas conference. Good luck to him. In his stead, we've got our senior economist, Matt Grudnoff. Hello, Matt.
I'm the backup economist.
You are. How are you today?
I'm all right, yes.
Yeah, that's very good. You're a bit more peppy than Greg. You might have to tone it down.
Okay, all right. I'll start acting a little bit more depressed.
Okay, it's what I'm used to. So, Matt, the RBA's cut interest rates recently. That is, from what I hear from Greg, a good thing. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. The economy is like a giant slug at the moment, slinking along, and that's mainly because it's under the weight of high interest rates. So it's good they're cutting.
Good. And that's good news, good relief for many Australians. But there are some potential negative consequences of cutting interest rates, aren't there?
Yeah, look, every time interest rates go down, it becomes cheaper to service a mortgage. People can go out and borrow more from the bank, and they do, and they all show up to the auction having been told by the bank, you can borrow more. And so what happens? They bid up the price of houses.
So when all these people are showing up to the auctions, that's including, people who are trying to buy their first house, but it's also including people who are trying to buy an investment property.
Yes. So most people or, first home buyers might think, great, interest rates have gone down. This is my opportunity to get into the housing market, to finally get my break and own my own home.
It's finally looking up.
But unfortunately, house prices, when interest rates drop, house prices start going up. And the problem with that is investors see, house prices are going up. Now's a good time to get in because every time house prices go up, I'm going to be able to sell it for more, make a ton of money, pay very little tax on it, and I'm going to be better off. So what we see is a big rush of investors rushing into the market as interest rates fall. And then what first home buyers see is the house prices race away from them again and they get left behind.
Yeah. I mean, obviously cutting interest rates is important, but this does seem like it's adding unnecessary fuel to the fire of the housing market as it currently is. But you had a report out recently that I thought was really interesting, and I don't understand why no one's doing this, which is not something it's
you
something.
And me both. You and me both.
I know. I mean, look, often when I read Australia Institute reports, I'm like, yeah, this is sensible. But I read this one and I was like, hang on a second. Why is no one doing this? So can you please explain to me what this report was looking at?
Well, lower interest rates do help first home buyers, you would think initially, be able to get into housing. But the problem is investors rush in and bid up the house price even more. But what if we could stop investors from rushing in? That is, hand the benefit of lower interest rates only to first home buyers, only to owner-occupiers, and keep the investors out. And that's essentially what we can do.
Yeah, sounds great to me.
So there's an organisation called the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, APPPA.
Okay.
You may have heard of it.
Basically, I have not, but sure.
Its job is to make sure that the financial system doesn't collapse, essentially, right?
Important work.
They're the watchdog who keeps an eye on the financial system because, GFCs, global financial
sometimes
crises,
they collapse.
They're bad, right? And so it's their job to make sure stuff like that doesn't happen. Well, if we go back about 10 years, APRA was worried because a heap of investors were rushing into the market and bidding up prices and borrowing really heavily. Now, they weren't worried that housing was becoming less affordable because that's not their concern. What they were worried about was that all of these investors were very risky loans for the banks. They were likely that if something bad happened in the economy, like another kind of global financial crisis, all of them could go bust at once. And they were worried about what that might do to the financial system. And so they said, well, okay, banks, APRA has the power basically to go to the banks and say, stop lending to these risky borrowers.
Mm.
Okay, and so that's what they did. They basically told the banks, stop lending to investors. And they have a number of tools that they can use to do this. But basically the outcome of that was banks stopped lending to investors, and they did that by putting up the interest rate on investor loans. So they didn't put it up on owner-occupier loans,
Yep.
right? But they did put it up on investor loans. And the result was that the number of people buying investment properties and the number of investment loans went down at the same time that owner-occupier loans went up.
Yep.
And what happened was housing became more affordable. So over the last 20 years, we've seen housing becoming less and less affordable. And there's one little spot in the entire sort of conga line of housing becoming less affordable where we saw a drop in prices, not a huge drop, but a kind of drop and flattening out in prices. And that coincided with APRA cracking down on investment loans. So effectively what APRA did is they put up the interest rates on investor loans, but not owner-occupier loans. First home buyers and owner-occupiers were able to keep getting into the market. They started buying the houses in bigger and bigger numbers, and investors were forced out. And at the same time, basically housing became more affordable.
And you say that they were forced out. They weren't completely stopped from getting loans. They still were able to.
Yeah, absolutely. So if they were willing to pay the higher interest rate, and it was about between 0.5% and 1% more than owner-occupier
So
loans.
nothing, not crazy.
No.
Yeah.
If they were willing to pay the higher interest rate, then they could still buy investment properties. It didn't exclude them completely. But what it did is it gave an advantage to first home buyers and owner-occupiers. And look, governments are always looking at trying to advantage first home buyers.
Yep.
There's first home buyer grants. There's, making sure that they only have to have 5% deposit. They do all these things, which unfortunately all it does is increase demand for housing and pushes up house prices. But if they were instead to disadvantage investors, to put a little bit more of a barrier on investors, then that effectively gives that advantage to first home buyers and allows them to get in. And rather than pushing up house prices, it actually slows house price growth down, or maybe even drops house prices a little bit.
I mean, all in all, this sounds incredibly sensible.
It does.
Yeah. Why isn't anyone doing that?
And also it's quick, right? And it doesn't cost money. It's not like the government then has to hand out money in the form of grants. It's not like the government has to put money into the game to basically pump money into the housing market. All they have to do is change the regulations, tell APRA to change the rules, and make it more difficult for investors to actually get a loan.
So this might sound like a silly question. Why don't they do this all the time?
Well, because at the moment, when APRA is looking to decide whether or not to deploy these new rules, they're not looking at housing affordability. Their goal is to make sure that the financial system is secure and safe. So what the government would have to do, the change the government would have to make so that this was happening all the time, is they would have to tell APRA, on top of making sure that the financial system was secure, your other mandate is to make sure is housing affordability.
Yeah.
When interest rates get cut, or when you see lots of investors rushing into the market and the house price go up, you need to step in and basically slow the increase in investment loans down.
Yeah.
Your job is to slow investors getting into the market. And if they were to do that, then basically APRA would be another tool for making housing more affordable. They would be constantly watching the market, and particularly right now, when interest rates are going to get cut, we've seen 2 cuts already this year. The market thinks, and I think, that there's going to be a lot more cuts to come. All right? And so the more they cut, of course, the more house prices are going to go up, the more investors are going to rush in. So now is actually the ideal time to do this. Now, if they get in now and stop those investors rushing in, then we can see these cuts to interest rates, which everybody sees as a good thing, actually benefiting first home buyers, not investors.
I mean, it sounds like a win maybe not all round, but it just sounds like it would be a just incredibly popular policy. It would be a good idea. And, obviously as we talk about a lot on this podcast, there are a lot of things the government should be doing to fix the housing market, like, fixing negative gearing, capital gains tax.
Yeah, so the negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount works in a similar way, right? It gives an advantage to investors. And if we were to get rid of, say, the capital gains tax discount and crack down on negative gearing, then that would make it harder for investors. So it's effectively the same lever, if you like. By doing that, we basically stop investors from getting in the market. We give first home buyers and owner-occupiers an advantage over investors. And so therefore, they're able to get into the market rather than investors. So it's the same lever that we're using. It's just a different way. Mind you, if you crack down on negative gearing, the capital gains tax discount, that doesn't just not cost money, that actually makes money, as in the government will collect more tax, right? This costs no money. Handing out first home buyers grants and the like costs the government money, right?
Yep.
And so, the best policy would be to crack down on the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing. But given that for some reason that's totally beyond me, the government is just not keen to do that. They don't seem to have the political courage to do that. This is another way that they get in and get in very quickly. I mean, we talk about supply, and supply is important, but supply is the most expensive, most long-term way of fixing the housing market. Should we do it? Absolutely. If we do it now, will it stop investors rushing into the market and pushing up house prices over the next year? Absolutely not. Right? It is going to take years and years, decades, to build our way out of this problem. It will cost us a fortune to build our way out of this problem. This is a way of solving the problem in the short term now and helping people who want to get into the housing market now.
Yeah, sounds incredibly sensible to me. And to anyone listening, if you wanted to read Matt's paper, it's on the Australia Institute website. It is a great read, and we'll leave a link in the show notes for that as well.
The federal government will double the tax rate of superannuation accounts worth over $3 million.
Australians will see this change as modest and reasonable and fair.
Let's be very clear about this. They haven't been up front with the Australian people.
This has overtaken inheritance tax in my list of the world's worst taxes. And yes, I do have a list in my back of my head.
I think this is really sensible. If you have a few $1 million tucked away in super, I don't understand why you should continue to get really generous tax concessions.
Matt, something that's been in the news lately has been superannuation. There are some super changes before Parliament at the moment, but they're pretty unpopular. Well, they're controversial in the media. Can you give us just a quick rundown about...
Just to be clear, these are super popular amongst the public.
Yeah.
All the polling I've seen is 70+%, 80% of people think this is a great idea. What are we talking about?
Yeah.
What are these super changes? Well, basically, these super changes are to reduce the super tax concession that people with over $3 million in their super accounts are going to get. So effectively, it means that people with giant super balances of more than 3 million are going to pay more tax.
Yeah. And just to be clear, how many people have a superannuation account with more than $3 million?
80,000 or 0.5%. So we're not talking about taxing the 1%. We're talking about taxing the 0.5%. Taxing the 1% more, that would be too much. Just the top 0.5%.
And also, to be clear, this isn't taxing them more. It's a reduction in a tax cut.
Yes, that's right. So these people would still get a tax concession. We're just going to reduce the amount of the tax concession. So it's important to understand what that means. So at the moment, a tax concession is basically the government giving you legal permission to pay less tax than you normally would.
Yep.
Now, why would the government do this? Well, because it wants to encourage something, right? So one way of encouraging people to do good things is to say, if you do this thing, then we will let you pay less tax. So donating to charity is a great example, right?
Yeah.
If you donate to charity, that's tax deductible. The government says, because you've done that, we will reduce the amount of tax you have to pay.
On
we'll
that
give you
note,
a benefit.
The Australian Institute is having our end financial year appeal at the moment. All donations over $2 are tax deductible. Anyway, Matt, carry on.
Exactly right. So encouraging important good behaviour.
Yeah.
So why would the government give you a tax concession to encourage you to put money into super? Well, if you've got more money in your super, then you're less reliant on the government when you retire, particularly the age pension, right? So more money in super means the government doesn't have to pay out as much to people when they're retired. So that's basically why they've given this tax concession.
The whole purpose of this tax concession is to encourage people to save so they're not reliant on the age pension.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
But people with enormous balances in super are never going to be reliant on the age pension. And just to put $3 million in context, right? If you have just over $1 million in assets outside your family home as a retired couple, then you get zero age pension. That's the cutoff point for the asset test. So keep that $1 million figure in your head. If you have more than $1 million in super, right, you are never getting the age pension. In fact, if you have less than $1 million in super and other assets, apart from your family home, you're never going to get the age pension, right? So why are we giving a tax concession to encourage people to save more in their retirement so they're not reliant on the age pension if we know that they are never going to be reliant on the age pension?
Yeah.
And the answer is, well, there is no reason, right? It's because this has become a great scam for rich people to squirrel money into so they can pay less tax.
Yeah.
And essentially, everybody has known this is a giant scam. If you go to a financial planner as a rich person, the very first thing out of their mouth is going to be superannuation. The first bit of advice they're going to give you is put more money in your superannuation because it is the best way to avoid tax as a rich person. So what started out as a great plan to try and make people save for their retirement has turned into this big tax dodge for rich people. And the government's basically, thank goodness, finally starting to crack down on this. And while this might be insanely popular out in the general public, it is not popular with one small group. Can you guess what that group is, Elinor?
I would guess that it's that 0.5% of people who
Ding, 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 ding. Absolutely correct. And their mates in the financial press, right, and also in the coalition have been going nuts about this, right? They have been trying to convince the rest of us not that they should get big tax concessions and pay less tax and keep their big tax dodge. No. They've been trying to convince the rest of us that $3 million in your super is not actually that much.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's put this in context, right? If you're in your 60s, you're about to retire. You're getting close to retirement. So, and you've probably got as much in your super as you're ever going to have in your 60s, right? So it accumulates up, and then once you retire, it starts going down. So it kind of peaks around your 60s. The median super balance in Australia for people in their 60s is about $250,000, not $3 million. Less than a tenth of that, $250,000. That is, half of people have less than $250,000 in their 60s, and half of the people have more. If you've got 3 million, then you're in that top 0.5%, right? So this is a tiny number of people it's going to affect. And these people are basically trying to whip up this scare campaign to stop the government from cracking down on a tax loophole. And what does cracking down on this tax loophole mean? Well, it means an extra $2 billion a year for the government. It means that the government can better fund services and it can better provide the things. And also, may I just say that the financial press, the same people who are getting outraged about this change are the same people who, stroke their chins and tut, look at the size of the deficit. The government really needs to lower the deficit.
Yeah.
All right. So long as they don't tax rich people more.
I mean, yes. I love the visual imagery you bring to this. And just on some other, the other fear-mongering we've been seeing around this, we got a question from Fran, who is not the one doing the fear-mongering. She just has the question. Can you please explain what unrealised capital gains are in relation to the possible reduction of tax rates for super balances? And if you think it will be a problem?
Yeah, look, so the other part of the scare campaign, rather than just the tax thresholds not being indexed, is this idea that they're now going to tax unrealised capital gains above $3 million. And what does that mean? Well,
it sounds like a lot of economics talk.
It does. But let me try and make it really simple and really quick, right? So if you've got a chunk of money in your super fund, right, you want it to earn you a return. So, you've got money flowing in every fortnight from your wage, but you don't want that money just sitting there under a mattress doing nothing. It would be good if it was earning you money. So let's say you buy your super fund buys a heap of shares with your super money. And then basically it's earning an income.
Yeah.
And the way shares earn income is in two ways. It earns income in the form of dividends. That is the profit that the companies you're invested in make. You get some of that profit. All right, so that's part of the thing. And the other way is the shares go up in value. So maybe you bought the shares for $20 and now they're worth $25. Basically, your shares are more valuable. That's what we call a capital gain, right? And normally, before we tax capital gains, we wait until you sell those shares. So you buy the shares at $20, they go up to $25. But if you haven't sold them, you don't pay any tax until the time you sell them. Then they look at how much you bought them for, how much you sold them for. They work out what the capital gain was, and then it gets added into your tax.
Yeah.
But what the change is going to be, and I stress this is just for people with super balances over $3 million, what they're going to do is they're going to value the superannuation account at the beginning of the financial year, and they're going to value it at the end of the financial year, and they're just going to apply the tax on that increase in value. And part of that increase in value is going to be the dividends, say, from the shares, but part of it is also going to be that the shares go up in price. So effectively what they're going to do is they're going to tax those unrealised capital gains. Now, we do actually tax on unrealised capital gains now in other ways. So when you pay rates, for example, or land tax, so when the local government sends you a rate notice, if you're lucky enough to own a home, for those of you who are renting out there, this example is not going to make any sense to you.
No.
And look, I'm sorry. And, Elinor is in that thing.
Yep.
But basically, we get a rates notice every year. And it's not based on what we bought the property for, right? It's not based on what we bought the land that the house is on for. It's based on its current value. So even though we haven't sold the property, we haven't got a gain from it, that tax is based on the unrealised capital gain of the land, right? And there's other ways in which we tax unrealised capital gains. But mostly we don't do it because in order to tax unrealised capital gains, you have to constantly value the asset. You have to constantly go out and say, how much is your house worth? How much are the shares worth? Valuing shares is fairly easy because you've got the share market telling you all the time. But there are lots of different assets that people can have in their super fund, and they have to value it every year. But, and this is really important, right now, before this change took place, and this has been the case for many years, by law, every super fund has to be valued every year. So we already do the thing, right, that is stopping us from taxing unrealised capital gains. We already value it every year as part of the process, right? It has to be done. Okay, and so there's no extra, administrative cost in taxing unrealised capital gains, which is one of the main reasons we don't do it already. All right, and so all we're really doing is taking the information we have and saying, you know what, that unrealised capital gain, we're going to tax it every year, and we're going to tax that bit above $3 million. All right, and the other reason you might not want to tax an unrealised capital gain is that if you haven't realised the gain, you haven't got the cash from it, you might not have the cash to pay the tax.
Yeah.
And that might be true for people with few assets. If your share price goes up and you don't have that many shares, you might have to sell some of those to pay the tax. But we're talking about people, again, let me stress, with $3 million in their super fund.
Yeah.
These are not people who don't have a lot of cash. These are not people who are going to struggle to be able to pay that extra cash. The real reason that people are outraged that we're having to pay tax on unrealised capital gains is because not realising those gains is part of the tax dodge in super. And they're effectively cracking down on this tax dodge. All right. And so people with enormous super balances are going to have to pay more tax. Are they going to struggle to pay that tax? Almost certainly not. Right. 99.9% of these people are going to have no trouble doing this. And the outrage is not because there is this change is going to be a problem, that the government somehow come up with a new way to make everything more difficult. The outrage is that we have this giant tax dodge, the biggest and best tax dodge in Australia, and the government is cracking down on it. And I think that it's great that the government is cracking down on this, but let's be clear, at the moment we give $22 billion a year to the top 10% in super tax concessions.
Yeah.
$22 billion a year to the top 10%. The top 10% will never be on the age pension. $22 billion a year. We're wasting $22 billion a year encouraging people to put money into their super when there's no public benefit for it. And we're going to take $2 billion of that off.
So really, really not a big change.
Good first step is what I say. Good first step.
And more steps to follow.
And more steps to follow. You've got another
Hopefully.
20 billion there. Think about that. If we taxed all of that 22 billion, right, and there's no economic reason why we should be encouraging people to save if they're never going to get an age pension, we could do enormous things. We could put dental into Medicare. We could increase the unemployment benefits so that people were out of poverty. All right, we could lift people out of poverty. We could give them good healthcare, good education, and instead we're handing them this money over to rich people.
So good first steps, more to come, maybe, hopefully. Well, hope that answered your question, Fran. And if you want to hear more about the superannuation changes, Greg actually did an episode of Follow the Money this week, which will be in the show notes, and you can find that wherever you listen to podcasts. And thank you so much for coming on the pod, Matt. This has been great.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. We really appreciate it. If you want to read Greg's Grudnoff column, it's in The Guardian every week. And if you want to read more of our research at the Australia Institute, it is at australiainstitute.org.au, and that includes Matt's incredible paper about macroprudential reform, which is a word I have now learned.
It's the most boring word in the world.
Yeah, but the paper's great. This episode was recorded on the 29th of May, 2025, and things may have changed since recording. Our theme music is by Blue Dot Sessions. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you again next week.
Bye.